3 obscure books that quietly changed my life. You'll see the world differently. Finite and Infinite Games. James P. Carse, 1986. The Courage to Be. Paul Tillich, 1952. The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. Alan Watts, 1966. You know those rare moments when you're reading and you stop mid-page almost stunned, and you think, wait, how did I live before this sentence, before this idea? That's what these books did to me. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but quietly, subtly, almost like a shift in the lighting of a room. And the third one? That one rewired something in me, permanently. So stick around. You might feel it too. Knows a difference between a book that entertains and a book that rearranges. The entertaining ones, we finish, smile, maybe recommend to a friend. But the rearranging ones, they stay with us. They alter the lens. They change the angle of how the world looks when we wake up the next morning. And here's the strange part. It's almost never the famous books that do it. Not the trending titles, not the glossy bestsellers stacked at airport shops. It's the odd ones, the slim, forgotten paperbacks, the philosophy books with bland covers and too many footnotes, the books most people never pick up. And yet, those are the ones that sneak under the defenses. They don't shout, they whisper. And if you're paying attention, they tilt your entire perspective. Today, I want to share 3 of those books. They're not flashy, not mainstream. Some of them might even feel a little strange at first glance. But each one left a mark on me. They changed the way I see myself, other people, and the very shape of life itself. So, let's start with the first. A book that cracked open the very idea of what it means to play the game of life. Book number 1. Finite and Infinite Games. Picture this. A slim paperback from the 1980s. Beige cover. Philosophy, but not the kind you slog through with a dictionary in hand. More like a quiet manifesto disguised as a thought experiment. That's what James P. Carse wrote when he published Finite and Infinite Games. And at first glance, it looks simple. He divides life into 2 types of games, finite and infinite. Finite games? They're the ones we're most familiar with. They have fixed rules, clear boundaries, a start and an end, a winner, a loser. Think of soccer, elections, job promotions, debates, even something like chess. Everyone knows the rules. Everyone agrees when the game is over. And once it's over, that's it. It's done. The point of a finite game is singular, to win. But Carse says there's another kind of game. One we almost forget exists, the infinite game. The infinite game doesn't care about winners or endings. It doesn't even really care about rules, because the rules can shift, stretch, evolve. The point of an infinite game is to keep playing. Love is an infinite game. So is curiosity. So is art, parenthood, friendship, growth. And when I first read that, this tiny line, a finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing the play, I just sat there, book open in my lap, staring at nothing. Because suddenly, so many parts of my life looked different. Think about it. How much of our daily struggle is just us treating infinite games as if they were finite? We treat love like it's about winning. Winning someone's heart, winning an argument, winning approval. But love, if it's real, isn't a contest. It's not about scoring points. It's about continuing the play. Or take work, careers, the way society frames success. So much of it feels like a tournament. You get a degree so you can get a job. You climb so you can get the promotion. You earn so you can win retirement. But the game ends the moment you frame it like that. What if, instead, work was an infinite game? Not about beating others, but about expanding your craft, deepening your contribution, or simply staying curious for as long as you can breathe. Carse goes even further. He says entire civilizations collapse when they confuse the two. Wars, for example, are the tragic collision of finite and infinite mindsets. Nations that could play infinite games, coexistence, exchange, cultural growth, instead reframe the world as finite. Someone has to win, someone has to lose. Borders must be redrawn, and suddenly the game ends in destruction. Reading this today, in a world obsessed with rankings, followers, likes, headlines that scream about victory and defeat, it feels even more urgent. Because what Carse is really asking is, what lens are you living under? Are you chasing wins that vanish the moment you grab them? Or are you playing something larger, something that doesn't end? And here's where it got personal for me. I realized that even the way I measure progress in my own life is almost always finite. How many things did I check off my list? How many goals did I hit? Did I beat the version of myself from last year? But if you only ever play finite games, then every win is just the prelude to another ending, another finish line, another emptiness. Whereas in infinite play, the whole point is that there is no finish line. You're not racing, you're dancing. And suddenly, the anxiety lifts. It's not that finite games are bad. Carse is clear about this. We need them. Sports, contests, projects, deadlines, they give structure, they give intensity. But the danger is when we forget that they're finite, when we mistake them for the bigger game. It's like mistaking the stage performance for life itself. Once the curtain drops, then what? One of the lines that really stuck with me, I actually underlined it in the margins, was this: to be prepared against surprise is to be trained. To be prepared for surprise is to be educated. That sounds small, but it hit me. Finite games train us. Rules, rehearsals, practice, repeat. Infinite games educate us. They prepare us for surprise. They widen us. They make us ready not for one ending, but for the fact that the game never ends. It made me re-examine even my relationships. Like, am I approaching my friendships with a finite mindset? Keeping score? Measuring who texts first? Who owes who dinner? Who shows up more? Or am I just trying to keep the play going? To see how long we can keep weaving this thing between us, letting it morph and surprise us. That's the power of Carse's little book. It doesn't bombard you with footnotes or historical examples. It just plants this one distinction in your head, finite versus infinite, and then whispers, now, go look at your life again. And the unsettling part is, you can't unsee it. Once you realize that whole industries, institutions, even entire governments are locked into finite play when infinite possibilities are available, it changes the way you read the news. It changes the way you argue with people. It changes the way you think about your own legacy. Because in a finite game, legacy doesn't exist. Once you're gone, someone else wins. Someone else takes over. But in an infinite game, your impact continues, as long as the play continues. The love you showed, the ideas you shared, the seeds you planted in someone else's life. That's infinite. So when I finished Carse's book, I didn't slam it shut with a triumphant, I get it now. I just sat there, and I realized, almost with relief, that I don't have to win all the time. In fact, I don't have to win at all. I just have to keep playing. And once you see the world like that, you notice how rare it is, how almost everything around us is framed as a battle. But maybe the real game, the only game that matters, is the one that never ends. So that was Carse. A thin little book that opens a door you didn't even know was there. And suddenly, you see games everywhere. But once that door is open, another question sneaks in. If life isn't about winning or losing, if it's about continuing the play, then what do you do with the fear? The fear of losing meaning, the fear of being small, the fear of death. Because even if you choose infinite play, those shadows don't just go away. And that's where the next book steps in. It was written in the 1950s, but it feels timeless. It doesn't promise you victory. It doesn't hand you comfort. Instead, it teaches you something harder and maybe more valuable. It teaches you courage. Let's move into our second book, The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich. Part 1, The Weight of Anxiety. If Carse gave us a lens to see life as a series of games, some finite, some infinite, then Paul Tillich takes us somewhere heavier, somewhere darker. He takes us into the territory of fear. Not the surface-level fears we talk about in everyday life, like fear of spiders or fear of public speaking. Tillich was writing about the deeper, more haunting fears, the kind that creep in at night, the kind that leave you staring at the ceiling, whispering questions you can't quite answer. Tillich called it existential anxiety, and he believed it was baked into the very fact of being alive. Think about it. Every single one of us will face loss, failure, death. We know it. We carry that knowledge quietly, like a stone in the pocket. Most days, we manage to forget it's there. But every so often, maybe when a loved one dies, or when the future suddenly feels uncertain, we brush against that stone again, and the weight of it is undeniable. Tillich wasn't interested in comforting us out of this anxiety. He didn't write like a preacher telling us, "Don't worry, everything's fine." He also wasn't a motivational speaker promising that positivity would solve it all. No, his honesty was sharper, almost brutal. He said, yes, it's terrifying. Yes, meaning slips through your fingers. Yes, non-being waits for all of us. But courage isn't about removing those fears. It's about living anyway. And that's where the title comes from, The Courage to Be. Now, to understand why Tillich's words cut so deeply, you need to know a little about his life. He wasn't just a philosopher writing in a vacuum. He lived through both world wars. He served as a chaplain in the German army during the First World War. He saw the battlefield. He saw men broken in body and spirit. And later, when the Nazis rose to power, Tillich was outspoken in his opposition. He criticized Hitler openly, lost his teaching post in Germany, and eventually fled to the United States. This wasn't a man writing safe ideas from behind a desk. This was someone who had walked through chaos, exile, war, and despair. When he writes about anxiety, about standing in the face of non-being, he's speaking from experience. And that's why the book still resonates. Because Tillich doesn't minimize what it feels like to be human. He doesn't look away from death, failure, or emptiness. He stares directly at them, and then says, almost in a whisper, courage is the self-affirmation of being, in spite of the fact of non-being. That one line, it's like a stone dropped into still water. It keeps rippling. Because what Tillich is really saying is, your courage is not in conquering fear, but in existing alongside it. And when I read that, it landed in a way I didn't expect. I'd always thought of courage as the absence of fear. You know, the brave firefighter, the fearless activist, the person who walks through danger unshaken. But Tillich flips that image on its head. He says true courage isn't found in fearlessness. It's found in trembling hands that move forward anyway. That reframing alone made me rethink so many moments in my own life. Times when I thought, I shouldn't feel this anxious, this weak, this uncertain. Times when I believed fear disqualified me from being brave. Tillich says no. Fear is part of the deal. Courage isn't the absence of it, it's the embrace. And that subtle shift, it carries a strange kind of peace. Part 2. The anatomy of anxiety. Tillich believed that anxiety wasn't just one vague cloud hanging over us. He thought it had shapes, layers, faces. And in The Courage to Be, he maps out 3 of them. 3 fundamental anxieties that shadow human existence. The first is the most obvious, the fear of death. The simple knowledge that one day your lungs will stop, your heart will fall silent, and your body will return to dust. Every religion, every culture, every ritual. In some way, they're all responses to this one fact. We invent heavens and afterlives, legacies and monuments, partly because the raw truth that we vanish is unbearable. Tillich doesn't dismiss this fear. He says it's the root, the inescapable shadow. And yet, courage for him begins by acknowledging it without disguise, by saying, yes, I will die, and still, I choose to live today. The second anxiety Tillich names is subtler, but just as haunting. The fear of guilt and condemnation. This isn't about legal guilt, like breaking a law. It's about the quiet, inner guilt. The sense that no matter how much we try, we fall short. We fail others. We fail ourselves. We look back on decisions, words we said, people we hurt, chances we wasted, and the weight of it all presses down. Some people feel it as shame, others as regret. But Tillich says this fear of being unworthy, of being condemned by life itself, is universal, and the temptation is to bury it, to drown it in busyness or in substances or in distractions. But he insists that courage is the opposite. Courage is facing even our guilt and choosing to affirm ourselves despite it. And then there's the third, the most modern, the most insidious, the fear of meaninglessness. This one is less dramatic, but if you've ever felt it, you know how suffocating it can be. It's the 3 a.m. dread that whispers, what's the point of any of this? It's not just fear of death, not just fear of failure. It's the fear that none of it matters anyway, that life is just noise, that your existence could be erased and the universe wouldn't notice. Tillich saw this anxiety growing in the 20th century. After the wars, after the collapse of old certainties, science had dismantled the cozy picture of a universe centered on us. Technology had sped up life, but hollowed it out. And traditional religion, for many, had lost its authority. The result? An entire generation quietly wondering if meaning itself was an illusion. Sound familiar? It should. Scroll through social media and you'll see it everywhere. Cynicism, irony, nihilism dressed up as humor. Tillich would say, this is the anxiety of meaninglessness made visible. So, death, guilt, meaninglessness. 3 shadows, 3 weights. And he says they are inevitable. You cannot escape them. You cannot positive think your way out. You cannot outsmart them. What you can do is cultivate the courage to exist anyway. And here's the twist. Tillich insists that courage isn't about certainty. It's not about finding some airtight philosophy or perfect theology that erases the doubt. It's about affirming your being in spite of doubt. He writes, courage is the self-affirmation of being in spite of the fact of non-being. That phrase echoes, doesn't it? Because it's not triumphal. It's not "you will win." It's gentler, but stronger. It says, you may lose everything: your health, your reputation, your illusions. And still, the simple act of being, of saying yes to life in this moment, is courage. And when I sat with that idea, it loosened something in me. Because I realized that half my energy in life had gone into resisting fear, into trying to push it away, pretend it wasn't there. Tillich's book whispered, don't resist, acknowledge, and stand anyway. And suddenly, even the fear itself became proof of life. Proof that I'm here, that I care enough to feel it. And that, in Tillich's words, is the beginning of courage. Part 3. Courage, Faith, and the Ground of Being. Tillich doesn't stop at simply naming our anxieties. For him, philosophy is never just diagnosis. It has to offer a path forward. So after mapping out death, guilt, and meaninglessness, he asks, what can possibly give us the strength to face them? And here's where he introduces a surprising idea. Courage, he says, is not something we generate entirely on our own. It isn't just gritting our teeth, flexing our willpower, or repeating affirmations in the mirror. Courage, at its deepest level, is rooted in something larger than us. Pause. He calls this larger reality the ground of being. It's not a God you can picture, not an old man with a beard in the sky, not even a personal deity in the traditional sense. Instead, Tillich imagines it as the very depth that makes existence possible at all, the ground underneath everything, the mysterious isness that allows us to be here, in this moment, breathing, listening, wondering. For Tillich, faith is not about clinging to doctrines or creeds. It's about trusting this ground. Trusting that beneath all the shifting anxieties, there is still something holding, something in which our being participates, even when we feel small or meaningless. And so, courage is born not from denying anxiety, but from affirming that our being is rooted in this deeper reality. It's almost like leaning back into existence itself. I remember the first time I read this section. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Tillich's language is strange. Ground of being? What does that even mean? But the more I sat with it, the more I realized he was pointing to something I'd already felt, but never named. Think of those moments when you're walking outside at night, the sky above you, huge and endless. For a split second, you feel both tiny and infinite. You're aware of your fragility, but also of your connection to something vast, beyond comprehension. That's the kind of thing Tillich is trying to describe. Faith, in his sense, is not about certainty. It's about trust. Trust that existence itself has depth, and that even in the face of death, guilt, or meaninglessness, we belong to that depth. And here's where it turns practical. Tillich says this trust doesn't erase anxiety, it transforms it. Death is still coming, guilt is still real, meaninglessness still haunts. But courage becomes the act of saying, I participate in being. I trust the ground. I stand anyway. There's one passage where he puts it beautifully. The courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. It's paradoxical, isn't it? He's saying that even when every old image of God collapses, even when belief itself feels impossible, what remains, the raw depth of being, can still ground courage. And that spoke to me because it cuts across boundaries. You don't need to belong to a religion to understand it. You don't need to call it God at all. It could just be the trust that existence is bigger than your fear, that being itself is worth affirming, even when you can't explain why. And maybe that's the hardest kind of courage. Not the courage that comes from knowing, but the courage that comes from not knowing and saying yes anyway. Tillich, when I closed this section of Tillich's book, I found myself breathing differently. Like the weight was still there, but I was standing under it instead of collapsing. And that subtle shift from collapse to standing, that is Tillich's gift. Part 4. Living Courage in the Face of Despair. So far, Tillich has given us the map. 3 anxieties: death, guilt, meaninglessness, and the ground beneath them, being itself. But philosophy can feel distant if it never comes down to the daily struggle. Tillich knew this. He wasn't content to leave us with abstract words like non-being and ground. He wanted to ask, what does this actually look like in a human life? And so he describes the shape of courage in practice. The first form is the courage to accept yourself. That sounds easy, almost cliché, but Tillich makes it brutally clear. Acceptance is hardest when you see yourself fully. Not the polished version, not the curated persona, but the real self. Flawed, limited, guilty, anxious. Tillich says courage is not denying that shadow, nor drowning in it. It's looking at yourself, failures, contradictions, shame, and still saying, I affirm this being. I am, despite it all.
This struck me hard because self-acceptance, for most of us, is conditional. We accept ourselves when we succeed, when we look good, when we're praised. But the moment guilt shows up, the moment failure is undeniable, the voice of condemnation takes over. Tillich is radical here. He says courage is precisely in that moment, not when you're shining, but when you're trembling. The second form he describes is the courage to accept others. And this one feels even harder. Because if we struggle to face our own flaws, how do we face theirs? Tillich believed that the anxiety of non-being isolates us. Each of us, trapped in our private fears, tempted to wall ourselves off. But courage is relational. It means opening to others and their brokenness too. Not pretending they're perfect, not demanding they erase their shadows, but affirming, you are. And because you are, I will stand with you. The third form is the hardest of all, the courage to accept reality itself. This is where Tillich really pushes, because reality is not safe. It contains loss, violence, absurdity, silence. To embrace reality is to embrace a world that doesn't always give answers. And yet, he says, courage is precisely this embrace. Not resignation, not nihilism, but a quiet yes, spoken even through tears, even through doubt. Reading this, I thought of those moments in my own life when despair felt like it could swallow everything. Times when meaning drained away, when even getting out of bed felt like moving a mountain. And Tillich's words didn't make that despair disappear, but they reframed it. They whispered, even here, being is possible. Even here, courage is possible. To breathe, to stand, to say yes. That itself is victory. And maybe that's why his book still matters. Because he doesn't promise escape. He doesn't say, if you just think the right way, fear will vanish. He says, you will fear. You will despair. And still, you can be. That's not shallow comfort. It's deeper than comfort. It's an anchor in the storm, not a fantasy that the storm will end. And here's where Tillich's writing reaches a kind of paradoxical beauty. He insists that courage always carries anxiety with it. If you feel no fear at all, it's not courage, it's ignorance or denial. True courage, he says, is always trembling, always standing at the edge. So when you feel anxious, afraid, uncertain, that's not proof that you lack courage. It might be proof that you're in the very place where courage is being asked of you. And that reframing, it lingers. It changes how you see yourself, your struggles, even your darkest nights. Because suddenly, the presence of anxiety is not failure. It's the very condition of courage. Up to now, Tillich has sounded like he's speaking to the individual. You, me, our anxieties, our struggles, our quiet moments of fear. But Tillich insists that the courage to be is not just personal therapy. It's not only about helping a single reader survive their sleepless nights. It's about something much larger, the survival of humanity itself. Because think about it, societies are built out of anxious individuals. And when fear dominates a culture, it spills outward. It shapes politics, religion, economics, even war. Tillich had lived through this. He saw what happened in Germany when collective anxiety about poverty, humiliation, instability curdled into the rise of fascism. He watched how fear made people surrender their individuality to the promises of totalitarian leaders. He saw how entire nations tried to bury their anxiety by lashing out at others. And he concluded, without courage, communities collapse into despair or violence. Without courage, cultures become brittle, angry, destructive. So courage, for Tillich, is not optional. It's essential. It is the antidote to the collective sickness of fear. Not the courage of blind nationalism, not the courage of reckless aggression, but the courage to affirm life, even in its fragility. The courage to embrace others, even in their difference. The courage to hold on to meaning, even when the old certainties have crumbled. He writes that this courage is the universal human task, and that if we fail at it, if we let anxiety run unchecked, then non-being wins not just over individuals, but over civilizations. And this is why his book still feels urgent, because we live in an age where collective anxiety is everywhere. Economic uncertainty, climate fear, political division, the digital storm of voices reminding us daily of how fragile everything is.
It would be easy, maybe even natural, to collapse into despair, to numb ourselves with distraction, or to hand our fear over to leaders who promise safety, certainty, control. But Tillich's words echo across the decades. Courage is not the absence of anxiety. It is the will to affirm being. Yours, mine, ours. Even with anxiety in the room. And that's what makes his book more than philosophy. It's a call. A reminder that in the face of death, guilt, and meaninglessness, our task is not to erase the fear. It's to stand. To say yes. To be. When I finished Tillich's book, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd conquered my fears. But I did feel something quieter. A kind of companionship with all the other trembling people who still choose to live, still choose to love, still choose to create in spite of it all. And maybe that's what courage really is. Not a roar, not a battle cry, but a whisper that says, I am. And that is enough. So far, we've looked at Carse, who split life into finite and infinite games, and Tillich, who taught us to stand in the shadow of fear. But there's still one more book to explore. One that doesn't just question the games we play or the fears we carry, but the very sense of self we think we are. And it comes from a writer who was equal parts philosopher, mystic, and entertainer. A man who tried to show us that the boundaries between you and the world might not be real at all. Let's move now into our third book, the book on the taboo against knowing who you are, by Alan Watts. Book number 3, The Book. Part 1, A Taboo We Don't Talk About. Alan Watts is one of those writers you can't quite pin down. Philosopher, yes. Mystic in a way, but also a performer. A man who could stand at a podium, light a cigarette, and have an audience laughing, even as he unraveled the deepest riddles of existence. In 1966, he published The Book, on the taboo against knowing who you are. And right from the title, you know you're in unusual territory. Watts wasn't writing about politics or ethics or even the usual themes of Western philosophy. He was writing about the illusion of the self. Now here's the taboo he's talking about. In Western culture, in the way we're taught from childhood, there's an assumption so deep we barely notice it. The assumption is this: you are a separate self, an individual sealed inside your skin, looking out at a world that is fundamentally not you. That's the story we're all handed, and Watts says that story is the greatest illusion of all. He draws on Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, but translates them into a language that feels almost casual, like he's explaining it to you over tea. And his point is startling. The separation between you and the universe is a trick of perception. You are not in the universe. You are the universe, experiencing itself through one point of view. Think about that for a moment. If you take it seriously, it rewires almost everything. The fear of death? If you were never truly separate to begin with, what does it mean to end? The fear of loneliness. If separation is an illusion, then connection is not something you have to earn. It's what you already are. Even guilt and shame begin to shift, because they rest on the idea of a separate self who could have done otherwise. Watts doesn't argue this like a lawyer, piling up evidence. He invites you to feel it, to sit back, loosen the tight grip on your identity, and consider the possibility that the whole game of me versus the world is built on a misunderstanding. When I first read this book, I resisted it. The idea that I am the universe sounded, honestly, a little ridiculous. But Watts is clever. He doesn't force it. He just keeps nudging, with jokes, with analogies, with moments of sudden clarity. And slowly, the resistance softens. You begin to notice how much effort goes into maintaining the illusion of separation, how much fear is tied to the story of the isolated self. And then, for a brief moment, the knot loosens. You feel smaller, yes, but also connected, like a wave realizing it's not separate from the ocean. That's the taboo Watts is breaking. Not sex, not politics, but the taboo against knowing who you really are, which in his view is not a lonely ego, but the universe itself, playing at being you.
Part 2. The Illusion of Separateness. Watts had this gift. He could take a concept that sounds abstract, almost mystical, and make it feel as obvious as breathing. And when it comes to the idea of separateness, he uses metaphors that stay with you. One of his favorites is this. Imagine a whirlpool in a river. From a distance, it looks like a distinct thing. A little spinning circle, separate from the water around it. But look closer, and you realize the whirlpool is the river. It doesn't exist apart from the flow. It's just the river, moving in a certain pattern for a while. And Watts says, that's what you are. Not a sealed-off self floating in the world, but a pattern of the universe itself. A whirlpool of consciousness, here for a time, inseparable from the flow that created it. This is where the taboo comes in, because if we took that seriously, so many of the structures of our society would start to wobble. The fear-based scramble for status, security, survival, it all rests on the belief that you are a lonely ego fighting against the world. If that story collapses, then suddenly, life looks less like a battlefield and more like a dance. And Watts leans on that image a lot. He says life is not a race to be won, not a puzzle to be solved. It's a dance. And the point of a dance is not to arrive at the end. The point is the dance itself.
That's why, he argues, so many of us are miserable. Because we treat life as a finite game, always chasing a finish line. We study to graduate. We work to retire. We chase money to feel safe, status to feel real. But the moment we reach one end, another appears, and we never actually dance. Watts flips the frame. What if the meaning of life is not to arrive anywhere, but to participate fully, here and now, as part of the cosmic dance? The first time I read that, I laughed, partly because it sounded almost too simple. But then I realized how rarely I actually live that way. How often I rush through the moment in front of me, eyes fixed on some imagined goal, as if the present is just an obstacle. And it hit me. Maybe Watts wasn't being simplistic. Maybe he was naming something I already knew, but had buried under layers of ambition and fear. And this is why his writing feels less like theory and more like a mirror. He doesn't just hand you new information. He unsettles the story you've been carrying, that story of me versus the world. And once you glimpse how fragile that story is, you can't quite go back. Because if you're not a separate self, then what is death? If you're not an isolated ego, then what is loneliness? If you're not the sum of your possessions, achievements, or labels, then what are you? Watts doesn't give you a neat answer. He gives you an invitation. Loosen the grip. Step into the flow. Stop trying to win the game and start noticing the dance. Part 3. Death, Fear, and the Not Loosening. If there's one fear that keeps the illusion of separateness alive, it's death. From childhood onward, we learn to see death as the ultimate enemy, the finish line, the black wall. And if you believe you are a separate, isolated self, then of course death feels like obliteration, the end of me. Watts confronts this head-on. He says our fear of death is built on a false premise. Because we think of ourselves as a little I trapped in a body. Death feels like annihilation. But if the truth is that you are not separate, if you are, in fact, the universe experiencing itself through a temporary whirlpool called you, then death is not obliteration. It's transformation. The whirlpool dissolves back into the river. The dance step ends, but the dance continues. And in a way, you continue too. Not as the narrow ego, but as the flow you always were. That doesn't mean there's no grief. It doesn't mean there's no loss. But it does mean that death isn't the terrifying void we've been taught to see it as. It's a return. And here's the taboo. Most cultures, most religions, most systems of power, they depend on our fear of death. Because if we're terrified of ending, we'll cling harder. We'll buy more, pray more, obey more. We'll look for saviors and securities to protect the fragile ego. But if that fear loosens, if death is no longer a wall, but a doorway back into what we never left, then suddenly, much of our anxiety loses its grip.
I'll admit, when I first read this, I felt resistance. It sounded comforting, but also dangerous. Like, if I really believed death wasn't the end, would I stop caring about life? Would I become careless? But Watts anticipates that objection. He says the opposite happens. When the knot of fear loosens, life becomes more precious, because you stop rushing to escape it. You stop living as if this moment is just a stepping stone to somewhere else. You start tasting the now. He puts it in his playful way. You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at itself. Think about that. Not a trapped soul, not a doomed ego,
but a window through which being itself peers out, just for a while. And when the window closes, the seeing doesn't stop, it simply shifts. Other windows open, other whirlpools swirl. The dance goes on. Reading this, I remember sitting with a strange mix of calm and unease. Calm because the fear softened, like a muscle unclenching. Unease because if this was true, then so much of how I'd lived suddenly looked frantic, like I'd been gripping tightly to something that was never really mine to hold. Watts doesn't erase the mystery. He doesn't offer guarantees of heaven, reincarnation, or eternal souls. He simply invites us to see death not as the negation of life, but as part of its rhythm, like silence in music, like space between breaths. And once you see it that way, the fear starts to loosen. Not vanish, not evaporate, but loosen, like a knot that's been tied too tight, finally giving a little. And maybe that's enough. Freedom beyond the ego. Once Watts has loosened the knot of death and separateness, he turns to another illusion: control. The story of the isolated self doesn't just make us fear death. It makes us cling desperately to control while we're alive. We spend our days trying to manage outcomes, to polish the self, defend the self, prove the self. Our egos become like little dictators, constantly scheming, worrying, planning, comparing. And the more we grip, the more anxious we become. Watts asks, what if this need for control is the very thing making us miserable? What if life is not meant to be controlled, but participated in? He uses another image here, one that stayed with me. He says, imagine trying to grasp water with your fist. The tighter you squeeze, the less you hold. But if you relax your hand, if you let it flow through your fingers, suddenly you can feel the coolness of it, the reality of it, without losing it. Life, he says, is the same. Clench too hard and you lose it. Let it flow and it reveals itself. This sounds simple, maybe too simple, but think of how much of our lives are spent clenching. We clench around our careers, terrified of falling behind. We clench around relationships, afraid of rejection. We clench around identities, who we think we are, or who others think we should be. And all the while, the water slips through. Watts insists that real freedom comes when the illusion of the separate self dissolves. Because once you stop identifying with the little ego, once you see yourself as part of the larger flow, the compulsion to control relaxes. You no longer need to prove yourself to the universe. You are the universe. And with that realization comes a peculiar kind of freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom from always needing to be something more. The freedom to dance with life as it comes, instead of trying to choreograph every step. I remember one passage where Watts almost teases the reader. He says, "You are a function of what the whole universe is doing, in the same way that a wave is a function of what the whole ocean is doing." At first, that can feel deflating. Wait, you mean I'm not in charge? I'm just a wave? But then, if you sit with it, the tone shifts. Because what could be more majestic than being a wave of the ocean itself? Not a small, isolated creature battling the universe, but the universe, moving, rising, falling, breathing as you. And that reframing changes how you see freedom. It's no longer about escaping limits or forcing outcomes. It's about alignment, about realizing you were never separate to begin with. So the universe is not against you. It is you. When I finished this section, I felt a strange lightness, like a burden I didn't know I was carrying had quietly slipped off. Because so much of my life had been a fight to control, to secure, to defend. And Watts was saying, You don't need to fight the flow. You are the flow. That insight doesn't solve every problem. It doesn't erase pain or uncertainty, but it does shift the weight. And that shift, from clenched fist to open hand, feels like freedom.
After all the philosophy, the paradoxes, the dismantling of the ego, Watts brings it back to something simple. How do we live with this insight? How does seeing through the illusion of separateness change our daily existence? First, he says, it changes how we see others. If the self is not separate from the universe, then neither is your neighbor. Neither is the stranger you pass on the street. Neither is the person you love or the person you despise. That shift alone is radical, because suddenly, compassion isn't an obligation, it's recognition. To hurt another is to hurt yourself. To love another is to love yourself. And if that sounds like a cliché, Watts would probably grin and say, it only feels cliché until you actually see it. Second, it changes how we hold suffering. Pain doesn't vanish, loss still wounds, but the flavor of it changes. Because when you see yourself as part of a larger whole, even suffering has a place. It is not a cosmic mistake. It is part of the rhythm, a note in the larger song. This doesn't make it less painful, but it does make it less lonely. And finally, it changes how we meet life itself. With a bit more softness, a bit more humor. Watts loved laughter. He thought it was the most appropriate response to the absurdity of trying to pin life down with rigid ideas. He believed that once you stop clutching so tightly at identity and meaning, you can begin to play, to live more like a child, curious, engaged, unburdened by the need to get it right. He never promised that this perspective would eliminate problems. Bills still need to be paid. Bodies still age. Arguments still happen. But beneath it all, there's a quiet shift, from life as a battle to life as a dance. When I closed this book, I didn't feel like I had learned something in the usual sense. I felt more like something had loosened, like a knot inside me had untied itself just enough to let me breathe easier. And even now, when I catch myself tightening again, clenching at control, obsessing over identity, I sometimes hear Watts' voice, half serious, half laughing. You are the universe, playing at being you. And in that moment, things feel lighter. So, 3 books, 3 very different voices. Carse, with his vision of finite and infinite games. Tillich, with his quiet courage to be. Watts, with his playful reminder that you are not separate from the whole. On the surface, they don't have much in common. One feels like philosophy, one feels like theology, one feels like poetry disguised as prose. And yet, they all press against the same boundary. They all ask us to loosen our grip, to stop clinging to the illusion that life has to be neatly controlled, perfectly defined, or endlessly won. To see instead that life is participation, it's courage, it's play. And here's the thing, none of these books are flashy. They don't scream their importance. They're not plastered across TikTok or bestseller lists. But that's partly why they hit so hard. Because when you stumble across them, it feels like finding a secret. Not a loud revelation, but a quiet shift. And sometimes those quiet shifts end up being the loudest in your life. For me, these weren't just books. They were mirrors. And maybe that's what the best books really are. Not instruction manuals, not escape hatches, but mirrors that show us something we'd been circling all along, but never quite faced. So if you pick up any of these 3, don't rush. Don't read them like a checklist. Sit with them. Let them echo. Because they're not here to give you neat answers. They're here to shift the light, so you can see what's already been there from a different angle. And if they do that, even once, they've already done their work. Now I'm curious, which book did that for you? Not entertained you, not impressed you, but changed you, quietly, deeply,
Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, I'm always hunting for the next one that will rewire me. And if this kind of thing speaks to you, these quieter, stranger, life-shifting books, hit subscribe. This is where the rare ones live, because sometimes the books no one talks about are the ones that change you the most.